Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're so glad to welcome you as part of our community tonight. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and distributed live stream. By entering this virtual meeting room, you give your consent to be recorded and distributed by Simeon Moro EU and other third parties. If you prefer to not be recorded, please turn off your camera and microphone and/or go to the Facebook Live video feed, the link to which I will now place in the chat room. For a better experience, please turn off your microphone and set your video to gallery view. Tonight, our featured guests are Daniela Pisoiu, a researcher in the fields of extremism and terrorism, and Sagi Zilbershatz, a de-radicalization consultant. Also joining us tonight is Professor Lino Rivera of St. Mary's College of California. Welcome, Daniela. Welcome, Sagi.
Hi.
Hi, thanks for the invitation.
So, Daniela, tell us a little bit about your work, where you come from, where you are, and how you got into extremism and terrorism.
Maybe just briefly, it all started in Vienna, actually. I was studying there doing a master's degree. And at that point, the Madrid attacks happened, and these were the first major jihadi attacks in Europe, at least since the 90s, and of the new kind, the Al-Qaeda type. And I was interested to know why and to understand this phenomenon. So I started researching into that, and I did a bit of a tour to St. Andrews in Scotland, to the United States, then working in Germany as well. And basically what I've been doing for, I guess, about 16 years is trying to understand how jihadis and right-wing extremists radicalize by also talking to them, but also looking into other kinds of sources such as court documents. And part of my activities at the Institute is also to offer policy advice for the example for the Ministry of Defense with regard to terrorism trends worldwide. So what I do at the moment is basically a mixture of academic work and policy advice. I also teach at the University of Vienna. I've started to introduce this topic there because it had never been taught before. Security studies is not a big thing at the University of Vienna, political science, but people feel that it is necessary, and it is necessary to also have this kind of information taught to students. So yeah, it's a lot of things, just like Vienna, you know, a lot of stuff going on.
And so it was, you said, the Madrid attacks that first got your interest in extremism and terrorism. What
Yeah.
about that? What caused that interest? What interests you still today?
Well, it is, you know, it's a shocking event. It's a shocking happening. And the first instinct that people usually have is to say, you know, it's such an extraordinary thing. There has to be some kind of extraordinary cause that leads to it. And then if you look at the literature and you're talking to people and you kind of dive in the field, and you realize you stumble into a lot of normality. But still you need to explain how that leads to this horrible result. Also, when you talk to people, you know, people would think that terrorists in themselves are, you know, essentially evil. But then you realize that quite regular people radicalize and end up being terrorists, and what is going on? So it really is this process of A to B that is the puzzle that really, I mean, I guess interests a lot of people, but also myself.
Okay, Sagi, can you tell us a little bit about your work and where you come from and what you're up to?
With pleasure. So hello, everyone. My name is Sagi, and I'm originally from Jerusalem, Israel. I grew up in a I would say, very Orthodox community in Jerusalem. And so already at an early age, I could say that I've been exposed to a lot of extreme ideas, not violent at all. However, still extreme, both religiously and nationalistically, you could say. I left Israel when I was 16. I moved to Canada and then to Italy and then to Austria. But what shaped my views on the topic, or attracted me to the topic, was me growing up in the days of the Second Intifada. If you are familiar with the concept, the uprising in Israel, growing up with the threat that a bus can explode, that I can be stabbed or attacked at any point in the city. As a young boy, this definitely moved me, trying to understand why would people do that? Why would somebody explode in a bus, killing people they don't know for no reason, without any gain whatsoever? So this attracted me, and I've been involved in this topic one way or another, both in Israel and then abroad. And in Austria, in 2016, me and two other partners, we founded an organization called Not in God's Name. The goal was to both integrate and potentially de-radicalize Muslim youth using role models, mainly Muslim martial artists. So MMA fighters, people that are very well known, famous, won titles in Europe, stopped in the street for signatures, and we took them into the classrooms, raised all kinds of difficult topics, and through that created a discussion that hopefully led to positive results. Today I'm again doing a lot of my own research, and I'm also active in the Radicalization Awareness Network. As mainly my focus is on narratives and online narratives. Yes, so that's in short.
Okay. Daniela, could you tell us a little bit about what your day is like? Are you just reading periodicals all day, or are you out meeting terrorists or calling them up and going on dates, or how does it work?
Well, it depends. There is a regular schedule of the university, which is, I guess, the only constant. Otherwise, there's, of course, research projects, and it depends. For example, one of the recent research projects that we had was to develop a video game using exactly what Sagi just said, counter narratives, alternative narratives. And for that, I went out and interviewed people to understand even more, and especially in the context of Austria, how they radicalize. And I talked to quite a few jihadis and right-wing extremists, and that was quite an intensive time. And yes, as you say, I mean, it's you have to be very flexible, because it's not easy to get access, and of course they have a lot to lose by talking to you. Therefore, you have to, of course, ensure complete anonymity and all that. But this kind of research is really important to understand from their perspective how it is to radicalize, because otherwise you cannot develop measures to counter it. So that can be very hectic. Then November last year, it was very hectic. I think myself and others in the field probably haven't slept in 2 days, because it was a lot of requests also from the media, but also for ourselves. It was a lot of reading up to do. Why haven't you done something to prevent this? And this is, I guess, also one of the things that we haven't perhaps mentioned so far, that we are also kind of have a responsibility in this field, which makes a bit different to others. I mean, it's not just the curiosity of an academic to understand why things happen, but it's also a little bit of responsibility to make sure that less of it happens.
And can you tell us, Danielle, a little bit what happened last November? What are you talking about?
Oh, it was the attack in Vienna. It was a jihadi attack in Vienna, when a person basically took a gun and just shot at people randomly in the Vienna city center. It was in the evening.
No? Yeah.
What, sorry?
An AK-47 it was, no? Or like a actual machine gun?
Well, yeah, but the point is that it was, I mean, of course, the whole thing is horrible, but the most horrible thing is perhaps this randomness, and this makes terrorism, particularly heinous. That it is directed at just whoever. And yeah, it was the evening before the lockdown, so the individual actually put some thought into, organizing this when in an evening where, first of all, it was the last chance to get all these people gathered around at restaurants, but also to get a lot of people because everybody wanted to, take advantage of this last moment when they could still go out before the lockdown. And this was definitely, I mean, that was the first jihadi attack in Austria. Austria thought for a long time that it is in some way shunned from this kind of violence, also because of its neutrality and other things. But yeah, I mean, that was November.
Okay. And can you tell us about this Austrian think tank that you're a part of?
This is the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. We are a little bit of a hybrid. So we do academic research. We also do policy advice. We are, however, non-partisan. So we are not affiliated with any political party. And our analyses are also not influenced by ideologies. This is very important because you often find lots of research and science that is in service of a particular ideology or political party. So that's what we're not doing. We work, apart from my field, which is terrorism, I also have colleagues who work on, for example, the EU neighborhoods policy, and particularly Northern Africa, Turkey, the Western Balkans, and also on issues such as military and women, peace and security. So we have a strong security element, but we also do other things related to international relations.
Understood. Sagi, can you tell us a little bit about your days?
With great pleasure. By the way, I apologize if my voice breaks because I'm a bit sick, so just to mention that. My day is quite diverse because I don't do only counter-radicalization. I have also several companies in Vienna in different fields. So it's actually also quite diverse. I have a tourism business and a marketing consulting agency and some other things going on. When it comes to counter-radicalization activities, I would say that it's mainly a lot of reading and a lot of talking to people. I'm especially involved with Jewish community-related concerns and a lot of also Jewish-Muslim gap bridging, you could say. So also the terror attack that Daniela mentioned was quite a concern for the Jewish community, mostly because it started next to the synagogue, which was believed to then be part of a bigger plot against the Jewish community, even though the synagogue was closed because of Corona. But then there were many activities that are now being initiated, especially in schools or with youth, to bring more people to get to know the Jewish community. Now there is a second threat given the escalations in the situation in Israel. Now it's a bit more relaxed, but in the last week or so, there have been attacks against Jews all over Europe. So also here in Vienna, this has been a concern that the Jewish community raised. And so this is part of the activities that I'm doing. In general, I really like what Daniela said about the responsibility that you feel. I think that some colleague of mine said that this is one of the fields that if nothing happens, you get no credit because nobody knows. If something happens, you get all the blame. So that's quite a good definition of what it is. Yeah, and eventually a lot of it is also unexpected. Even though in this particular case, it was expected. I mean, the man was in prison before, and he also bought weapons in Slovakia and the police. But we will not point fingers. We will just say that in general, things like that are very difficult, and they require a lot of prevention activities well in advance to, like Daniela said, reduce it to the minimum that you can. But yeah.
Okay. So Daniela, can you tell us a little bit about the field of de-radicalization? What is it? What does it entail? What's it mean exactly?
Well, radicalization is a term that was invented in Europe after these initial jihadi attacks in Madrid and London. And it reflects especially the policy interest at the time to understand how people become terrorists. So it's not like before there was no research on terrorism at all, but one didn't use the word radicalization. One used something like the process of becoming a terrorist or becoming a terrorist, right? Now, of course, radicalization is also used in other contexts, such as, for example, with reference to extremists. It doesn't have to be necessarily terrorists. So that's the one part. And de-radicalization reflects the concern of policymakers, but also researchers, to understand and promote people leaving terrorism behind. So leaving behind the ideology, the group. And there's many theories on both sides, how people radicalize, but also how organizations radicalize, and how they then de-radicalize or disengage.
And what about your publications? You asked that we talk about some of your recent publications published by Routledge. We have Theories
Yeah.
of Terrorism, 2017, and Islamist Radicalization in Europe from 2013.
So the first book, The Theories of Terrorism, it's supposed to be an introduction to the field of terrorism studies. Terrorism studies has become a field of itself, but it's very interdisciplinary. So you have theories and approaches from all sorts of disciplines, from political science, sociology, criminology, psychology, religious studies, and much more. So for somebody who's trying to maybe just get a glimpse of it, or as a student, it's difficult to understand or to get a grasp of the field. So what the book is trying to do is basically to take all this mass and give it a shape and classify it and give it a structure. And it's covering a number of topics, including things like counterterrorism or state terrorism, or where does the word and the approach terrorism come from in the first place. But apart from this, a big part of it is to understand how and why people and organizations radicalize. And here, basically, I identify three main or major approaches. One is to think about this in terms of root causes. And I think many of you in the public also have heard this. So what are the root causes of radicalization, of terrorism, right? And this is a little bit the assumption to say that, you can identify certain causes, and if you remove those causes, then you don't have any more terrorism. It's done, right? And there's a couple of problems with this approach. Such as, for example, the specificity issue. Yeah, so you have many people who have these characteristics, such as, I don't know, poverty or lack of education, but they don't become terrorists, right? And there's another approach looking at it in a strategic perspective. So, what is the gain of terrorism? What do organizations have to gain if they engage in terrorism? And also for individuals, what do individuals have to gain if they are part of a terrorist group? Or an extremist group, or from engaging in a terrorist act. And this comes very much from a criminological perspective, looking at crime in terms of gain rather than, pushing, like causes that push people. And then the third is looking more in a relational perspective as a process. So it's not, A leads to B, and it's not this kind of looking into the future, or at least kind of, what's in it for me, but more like, a flexible, a flowing type of development where you have different kinds of actors, you have organizations, you have individuals, you have the state, and basically terrorism and terrorist acts emerge out of this interaction at some point. So you have this kind of contextual perspective looking at things.
Understood.
But of
Sagi,
course, for each of these things, you have quite a few individual theoretical approaches and hypotheses. So.
Understood. And Sagi, when you hear Daniela explain her research, what are your thoughts?
That it's fascinating. It's really interesting to talk about the causes and motivation, or what makes somebody radical. One particular case that I found always fascinating, and it's one case that I also found bizarre, was also in Israel. Again, Israel attracted me a lot. It was in Haifa, a city in the north, where a woman, 31 years old, a lawyer, entered if I'm not mistaken, it was a restaurant or pizzeria, and blew herself up, killing about 14 people. And to me, this was a very, very bizarre case because she finished 7 years studying law. She was a woman, a young woman. She studied law in particular, meaning that she kind of believed that she can fight the system through the legal system. Otherwise, why would you study law? And yet she decided to end her life afterwards, killing men, women, and children without discrimination. Like, and this bizarre case really shocked me, of course, but also fascinated me as to what really then gets people to do these kind of actions. Because in the past, I thought that there is a clear profile, right? You would look at the mostly men, mostly young men, maybe religious or at least some kind of affiliation to some specific group with strict ideology or with outspoken ideology. And then you see this case and you ask yourself, wait a second, this doesn't fit any profile. And so I really am fascinated about Daniela's research, because if you look at it from gains perspective, what would you gain from this after working so hard in a different direction to build your life? I mean, what kind of level of also maybe desperation or extreme gain can you be in, like, in order to take such an action? I mean, it's really unclear. So I'm still searching and still asking these questions. So I will look into Daniela's research for sure to learn more.
Well, that's why we're having the conversation. So Daniela, tell us about your book from 2013, Islamist Radicalization in Europe, an Occupational Change Process. So this is where you referring to Sagi's point about terrorists becoming a terrorist. It can also be thought of as a form of employment and a form of identity. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So clearly, this process takes a while. So it doesn't happen, overnight. And people usually do not realize that they are, in the process of radicalizing. So I think it's important to remember that for the individuals themselves, what is happening to them seems absolutely normal. Also because everybody around them tends to think the same. Yeah, so you very rarely have individuals who are really loners. So you have a community who basically is like a sounding board for the kinds of ideas that they have. And in the book, basically, I reflect what I found out from, on the one hand, court documents, but also from talking to individuals. And it was the early days of radicalization in Europe. We had also the case of Mohammed Mahmoud in Vienna at the time, was the first case of a terrorist on trial in Vienna, in Austria at all. And he saw himself as a journalist. So he was working for Al-Qaeda, he was translating, and he actually established I guess, a media company in a sense. He was translating ideological material from Arabic into German, and his then wife into English. And they saw their activities as being journalists. And then you have other people who see themselves as managers, as doing finance, PR, and in a sense, they are actually doing these kinds of things. It's just, for the terrorist organization. And the approach is something that you can also find in sociology, saying like, if you're trying to understand why people do things, you have to try to get their perspective. How do they see themselves and what they're doing, not how we see it? I mean, our perception is completely different. And then the next step is to understand, how do you get there? Yeah, how do you get to actually have this alternative perception? And the argument is to say the main psychological processes are the same. So these individuals are also looking for status, for recognition from others. It's just a different kind of context. And this different context is, of course, very much influenced by the ideology. But it's not the ideology that you can imagine as in, I read a book and then I'm indoctrinated. No, it's about certain worldviews, certain frames, as they were, that they basically build up slowly but surely. Yeah, you start here very, maybe with some weird ideas about somebody, and then this whole thing basically builds up into a whole complete different view. But it's not just about the ideas, it's also the relationships. It's basically a reciprocal relationship between the group and the ideology. Being in a group that is slowly becoming isolated means that you only have access to certain ideology and certain ideas. And at the same time, these ideas make you only want to have contact with this group. So at the end, you have the so-called cell or clique or whatever that gradually feels under threat and has this skewed perception of reality. This threat feels imminent. It's going to happen every moment. If we don't do something, it's the end. And this basically is a precondition for then a violent action, for which, of course, you also need an opportunity because, it has to be there as well. So it's a complex process. But by the way, which you can also see in other ideas, is not typical for jihadis. It's the same for right-wing extremists, for example, as well. But on that, there will be another book.
We'll get to that in a moment. So Sagi, tell us, so are people who radicalize abnormal? Is radicalization something abnormal?
I don't think so at all. And I think that it's exactly like what Daniela said. In general, first of all, I can say that I met a lot of radicals that basically revealed their radical ideology because of triggers. Not like the general interaction was extremely peaceful and nice, as long as I didn't reveal where I'm from, for example. But then once I reveal where I'm from, then certain ideologies start to pop up. So in this sense, I believe that radicalization is a spectrum on which all people might find themselves at some point. I think the more conscious you are, the less likely you are to adopt certain radical ideas. But if you're a member of a group, for example, you might become radical in a slow process that you don't even realize. Yeah, so I agree with Daniela on this, especially. In Vienna, for example, in our activities working with the Muslim martial artists, it was really evident that it's extremely normal because we were dealing with high school students and we would just raise different kind of topics. Mm-hmm. Some are very normal topics, some are a bit more controversial topics. And then we would see how slowly people open up and reveal certain ideologies. Now, it doesn't mean that they will act on these ideologies. However, they're already there boiling. And perhaps with a little bit of more push, maybe something can happen with them. And so that's always really interesting to see that and to understand that. I think the understanding that it's normal really helps you deal with de-radicalization because you really believe that these people have a chance also to go back on the spectrum if you just create a dialogue, try to break certain ideas that they have by showing them different perspectives in a very, very nice, peaceful, innovative way, then it can work.
Okay, so before we move on to our second question, how does radicalization occur? I wanted to just follow up with Daniela to ask, so among us here tonight, among all of our participants, any of us could become radicalized? Is that true or is that false?
Well, theoretically, yes. The issue or the key is really the process. It's not the person. You don't have to be a particular person. There were initially the initial explanation was, people are crazy. I mean, what they're doing is crazy. Therefore, they have to be crazy. And there were some clinical studies, quite a few. Also in the 80s, there's a big study done by the German, sponsored by the German Ministry of the Interior on left-wing terrorists. There were quite a few in prisons and there were lots of interviews and everything. And they were looking especially for these deviant features and like personality disorders, and they couldn't find anything. Yeah. So it's not about who you are, but it's about the process and it's about situations. And we're also trying to show with the video, with the video game is that it's also, people's decisions. It's your decision. You have to be aware that, like sometimes stop and think, okay, this is the situation. This is what they're telling me. Maybe I should question this. I can decide. I don't have to do this. Yeah. So it's also the idea is that, it's a process, and it can also be stopped. You don't have to wait until the person is already radicalized. And that's really an opportunity as well.
Okay. So moving on to our second round table, exactly like you said, Daniela, it's about the process. And the question is, how does radicalization occur?
Well, it starts in a way that basically it's not quite obvious, or not obvious at all to the person in question. Yeah, and it's an interaction usually between a group or a friend or a mentor. So maybe you guys have heard that there's much talk about online radicalization, that people go online and they are basically radicalized by the internet, but that's not really how it works. Of course, the internet has its effect in many ways and intensifies a lot of mechanisms, but it's still about human interaction. And the beginnings can be through, I'm interested in the topic. I mean, at the time of the book, there was a lot of interest in certain political issues, and I think it still remains the case. People are intrigued about certain political injustices, or they're attracted through completely other channels, such as music, for example. So some of the guys I talked to, they were into hip hop music and such, and of course after a certain while they didn't listen to it anymore because it wasn't allowed, but that was the entry door to it. So it occurs a lot through entertainment as well. There's this kind of curiosity that people have. It's a lot about interaction with a particular group. And then the second overall phase is the one in which you focus on things. And that's really important, because you might be interested in things. You might look at all sorts of radical stuff, but then, you go on with your day and you do other stuff. But if you come in a situation in which you only look at, these kinds of information on these topics from these sources, then basically your life horizon is very limited to this. And this then, in a sense, defines what is valuable for you and your identity. So you become committed to this cause. And as I say, what I mentioned before, this thing with becoming isolated, reading only certain things and not others. And for these individuals, then if something happens, I mean, the perception of it is a lot more. It's a lot bigger, it's a lot more dramatic than for somebody else. So for example, you say, oh my God, this thing happened, I have to do something now, because it's exactly this skewed perception of things. And again, you have to have the opportunity. So thinking about our attacker in Vienna, right? One of the things that also comes into play is, what are the alternatives? And this is why prevention work is so important. Yeah. So even for this individual at that particular time, when he was already very radicalized, the question was for him, what else can I do with my life? Well, not much. They took away his ID. He couldn't have a proper job because of his terrorist past. He was a pariah. He didn't have an alternative network. That's very important. So if you're only caught in your clique, the one who's already radicalized anyway, what other source can you have for your self-esteem? Not much. And then again, this is not something to justify terrorism. So, often when you say these things, oh yeah, you're justifying. No, we're not justifying terrorism. We're trying to understand a phenomenon in order to be able to prevent it. Because, putting people to prison is not going to solve the problem at all. It's an easy way, but it's not an effective way.
Quite the opposite, actually. They get more radical in prison.
And is it true, Daniela, then, like you say, in the West, employment brings with it a certain identity, brings with it a certain sense of belonging. So without an employment, it's also difficult to fit into the mainstream?
Yes, for sure. I mean, it's part of the self-esteem. And I dare say also, if you're a man, right? So if you cannot afford certain things, it's a basic human need in the end. But having an employment also serves another purpose, in the sense of de-radicalization, because if you have an employment, you don't have time anymore to look at weird websites. you will meet some other people telling you some completely other things. So for example, just a short anecdote from a different perspective, right-wing extremists working and, having to work with a lot of people from Turkey. He was like, whoa, his first experience with the people that he actually completely hated. And then he had this revelation that they're actually quite nice. So having unemployment is not just about self-esteem, but it's, opening your way to different kind of social environments and getting you away from that, radical environment.
Okay, so we have a comment from Professor Lino Rivera of St. Mary's College of California. Lino?
Yes, Sagi and Daniela, it's very fascinating discussion. I got two questions here. Listening to what you have already said, what is the correlation between religion, because and extremism and terrorism? Because from my experience, a lot of people get converted. Okay, I'm either a Jew or a Muslim, and then I convert into Christianity, or from one branch of Christianity to another. It's all of this process that you are referring to. Is there a correlation between religion and this particular extremism and terrorism? And my second question is, why target the West? Why do they have so much hatred about the Western part of the world?
Okay.
Daniela? Sagi, why don't you go first?
I can go first and then yeah, so religion is an interesting question. So in principle, of ideology plays a role, and this ideology can be of different types. So for jihadism, the ideology is a little bit more, a bit more inspired from religion. What we would say is that religion is not a cause, right? But it's just like yet any other text that is used to create this ideology and then to motivate people. Now, during the process, it might make a difference. And this is one of the questions that we still have. Does, for example, paradise act as an additional motivator for somebody who, for example, offers to go on a suicide mission? Yeah, and this might be the case. The research that we have so far is that what really matters is the rituals before. Like you basically prepare the person in such a way so that there is a point of no return. They make a video, a statement, they cannot go back anymore. And this thing with paradise still remains there as a question mark if it really acts as an additional motivation. But I think it's very interesting what you said about, conversion, because it's also about changing a role, right? So you have a role and you leave that behind and you get a different role. And I think in that sense is actually a very, very good parallel. I look into that actually. And very briefly, why the West? In spite of what some people say, there is no inherent hatred against the West. It was a strategic decision made by Osama bin Laden, based on his calculation that so his fight was not with the West, it was with the Saudi Arabian regime that he wanted to replace. And basically the jihadi movement is initially a movement against what they consider dictatorial regimes, which they mostly are. And the wish to replace this with a different kind of regime. I'm not saying it's better, on the contrary, but anyway. And the point was that this regime was at that point in time, and still is, supported by the US. So the idea was, okay, we do not gain much ground against what they called near enemy. We have to attack the far enemy, because if the US withdraws, then they will, the Saudi Arabian regime, for example, and others will have less power, and then we can actually go on with our revolution. So that was a strategic calculation. Of course, there is also a different angle on ideology where, everybody who's not a Muslim should be killed and all that. But I think, in terms of terrorism, one should rather look from a strategic point of view rather than, fanaticism, religious kind of perspectives.
Yes, I would love to add, first of all, because I was a member of a religious group that you would consider, again, not negative radical, but radical in the sense that where I grew up, men and women would walk in separate sidewalks, for example. which is a radical idea in the Western world, for example. So I think that in general, religion has several elements that are perfect for potential radicalization. So first of all, there is a very strong group identity, right? I mean, you feel belong, and there are many things that make you feel belong, whether it's singing together the same songs, eating together, spending a lot of time together, doing a lot of rituals together that make you feel special. You know, it makes you feel like you are part of something very profound. You know, you like as if you found a better path than the general path. Some religions even make you feel chosen or extra special, right? Then usually religion often has a lot of charismatic leaders that that you look up to. Not always they have the credentials that you would look for in a mentor or something, but they know how to speak and they know how to make you feel something just by speaking to you. And so you look up to them and you also want to satisfy them. You want them to be proud of you being a member. Some of the religious groups have certain hierarchies. So you can also go up in certain ranks if you do certain things. If you're more devout and you do more for the group, then you will get more prestige from the group. So there are many elements that could eventually make you become more and more radical. And again, at the beginning, you don't see it as radical, but as you are deeply and deeply into the group, then anybody else becomes the outside, you know, they're not us. And especially in religions that are not missionary, the ones that are not looking for anybody else, then the us versus them is very, very strong, you know. And sometimes just by people believing in something else, they become automatically a threat, right? I mean, religion is based on faith, usually less on just logic, it's on faith. And so when somebody else's faith contradicts yours, it creates a certain dissonance in your mind that it's either you accept that there are several ways to live, or that you have the ultimate truth and anybody else is an infidel. You know, and then it depends on the certain level of threat that you might feel, or whether you want to prove yourself as a devout member of the community by perhaps doing something for another community. Now, regarding to the West, I have maybe again, I don't want to say biased, just because again I come from the Middle East, so it's different how it feels. However, I can just say that when it comes at least to Islam, it's important to remember that the Islamic Caliphate, right, the Muslim empire that ruled from, I would say, the 7th century, as it expanded slowly and ended with the fall of, some people at least see it like that, with the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the end of the First World War, means that actually we are in a very short time in history that there is no Muslim Caliphate, that there is no Muslim empire. And I know personally that there are many people that are bothered by every second that it's not, you know, revived. And so I do feel that there are certain motivation for certain people to revive it in certain ways. So I do feel like there is certain targeting of the West as the ultimate infidel. However, this is not an agenda that is both open or pursued, I think, in an organizational way at the moment, but many individuals are being attracted to the field of radicalization, to terrorism, with the hope that maybe one day the caliphate will revive and there will be Sharia law also in Vienna, for example.
Daniela, should we move on to our roundtable 3, or you have a response to Sagi?
Oh, just one short thing, perhaps, that, you know, concerning religion, because I mean, I think what you just described is actually fascinating, because you're describing radicalization mechanisms, right? But I think it's important to say that this is not, you know, religion or religious groups in general, but, you know, what you might call fundamentalist or extremist
Absolutely.
religious
Thanks
groups.
for clarifying that. Yes, of course, it's not all Muslims. However, I mean, there were surveys in several of the largest Muslim countries asking them if they would want, for example, Sharia law, or if it bothers them that there is no Sharia law for example, and there is no Sharia law because there are other minorities in their country. And the majority in countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, even Malaysia voted for Sharia law as the ideal law to have.
Yeah, no, but that's not what I meant. I meant these things about, prestige, feeling something special, charismatic, and that's what I meant.
Absolutely.
But about this other thing, I mean, I think it depends. Like Sharia is different perceptions in different countries. And I take your point that there might be some kind of a radicalization of religion in certain areas, or a revival of religion in many countries in different ways. Yeah, but that's a different story, I guess, different discussion.
So moving on, we're running out of time, unfortunately, but our next roundtable is themed, what is the relationship, similarities, and differences between extremism and terrorism? So Daniela, we have here this word terrorism in the West, and we think of radical Islam. We hear extremism, and we think about political extremism in the West. So tell us, are they the same?
Well, no, they're not the same. So extremism is basically refers to an ideology, and this ideology can be of different kinds, but it's basically an ideology or a movement, whereas terrorism is a tactic. So and the particular features of terrorism is about really those three targets. So you kill a target because you want to frighten a second target, and because you want something from a third target, which is the government usually. And this, as a tactic, has no ideological color, right? It can and has been used by extremists, but also by states who call themselves democratic. So you can have extremists who never resort to terrorism, and you can have terrorists in the sense that they have used this tactic who are not extremists. That said, also another thing that you can often see is that some of the terrorists are, for all intents and purposes, part of terrorist or extremist organizations, but they are not equally indoctrinated. Yeah, so you can have individuals, and especially now with Daesh, we've seen also from Europe a lot of people going who didn't have much knowledge about the ideology or about religion, for that matter. They were tried by completely other things, primarily. On the other hand, you have ideologues, and for me, these ideologues are, they don't do anything themselves, but they incite perhaps others, and they're very, very indoctrinated. And these are actually quite dangerous individuals. But that being said, the question is, what do you do about these things? Because, well, if it's not extremism, then they're not doing anything, so we just let them be. Or do we do the same thing that we do with terrorists? Do we prosecute them? Do we put them in prison? And I'm mentioning this because we're having this discussion now in Austria, where the only solution they came up with is that, we're just going to take the people, put them to prison, and keep them forever. That's it, right? But first of all, you cannot do this with extremists because they haven't done anything. You cannot punish somebody because they have a certain way of thinking. In fact, this would be actually quite detrimental to democracy. But there's other ways of fighting extremism. And in fact, these narratives and counter narratives are a very important element of it. That you have to actually enter into dialogue with these people. And if you enter in a dialogue, doesn't mean you agree with them or you think that what they're saying is good, but it's a way of trying to convince them otherwise, or at least to limit their reach to the people they're trying to recruit.
Understood. So just to be clear, you said at the beginning that terrorism is a tactic, and that so-called democratic governments also use it. So for instance, if the Secret Service, a secret intelligence service, assassinates somebody, say a journalist in a different country or in their own country, is that considered terrorism?
Well, for it to be terrorism, it has to be not limited to the particular victim. And that also, for example, a difference between terrorism and genocide. In genocide, you basically just want to kill people, you want to wipe them out. Whereas in terrorism, you kill some people, but these are not your main target. Your second important target is the people that are scared because they've seen it. And it's expected that they will put pressure on the government, for example, or another actor to do something in your benefit. And that's your main target. So that's a particular constellation of terrorism.
Understood. Sagi, your thoughts?
Yes, of course, I absolutely agree. I think that yeah, I agree that extremism in some elements is more difficult to deal with than terrorism. Terrorism you can define, you can deem a certain group as a terrorist group and have sanctions against it or prevent it in one way or another, whereas extremism is very, very difficult. We've seen it in the streets of Vienna about 2 weeks ago. There was a very large protest. On the one hand, pro-Palestinian protest, absolutely legitimate and absolutely democratic. However, certain people shouted for a second Holocaust, which is very extreme on the board. Like it should be, it's supposed to be illegal in Austria in general, but still nothing was really done, and it's very difficult to separate these people from the crowd and to what exactly should you do. The problem is also if you send them, people to prison, unless you keep them all their life, they're going to become more and more radical, and there is a huge problem of people becoming more and more radical in prisons across Europe. So this is a very, very difficult point. I can also point out that while extremism is almost exclusively a negative term, there is like extremism is far from the mainstream, right? However, there are certain extremes that of people that live in certain communities, let's say in their own world and doing certain things that perhaps it's not the academic, it doesn't fall into the academic definition of extremism, but I would personally see them as quite an extreme, but not as a threat. And so I think that extremism that we know in the West is the negative one. However, for example, I see my background as living in quite an extreme ideology, but I'm not sure if I see it as a negative still. I see it as as just another world.
Okay.
Yeah.
So moving on
Sorry,
to
can I
our...
just say something really quickly? I think
Yes.
because it hasn't been mentioned, extremism usually is defined also as something, well, opposed to democracy. So that's, yeah, just to have that also on the list.
And democracy meaning then?
Well, meaning everything from elections, but especially human rights, because, and this is important because many of the extremist movements, they say, well, we're democratic, you know, we don't have anything against elections and such. But what about human rights? You know, what about, you know, the equality between, you know, men and women? What about the dignity of all people? And that, you know, it starts to become edgy for them. But and just one thing, I mean, you know, like shouting things like this is actually punishable by law, you know? I mean, inciting hatred, I mean, you can actually punish people, not just because of the Holocaust and the special law in Austria, but, you know, I mean, you can think extremist, but you cannot, you know, start spreading hate against other people. That actually is punishable.
Yeah, I mean, we are yet to know if anybody was persecuted. That, you know, that's part of the problem. So on the one hand, like even if it should, and even if there is a law acting upon it, not always consistent, let's say.
Okay, so before we move on to our final roundtable, I'd just like to say that if anybody has any questions, any of the participants, Daniela and Sagi are here to answer your questions, hear your comments. Please, I believe Carol by God Forte has a question. Carol?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
I am amazed that the two of you have done what you are doing, Sagi and Daniela. It's an extraordinarily brave action that you have involved yourselves with. I'm wondering if there has been any brain science study on individuals who are extremists or terrorists, because beliefs lie within the amygdala and the hippocampus of the brain. So I would expect that those areas of the brain then are much more activated than they might be in other circumstances? Do you know of the science that would connect this?
Sagi?
Well, I think Daniela is much better than me in anything related to that. The only thing that I could maybe say is that a lot of what we consider extremism, we consider it because we have evolved in our ideals ourselves. So in terms of human rights, in terms of different understandings. However, I personally think that there are many beliefs that to one side would seem extreme, while to another side would seem completely normal. When you grow up in religion and you believe in, whether you believe in 72 virgins that you get in a certain point, or if you do certain act, if you become a shaheed, or if you believe just in regular heaven, how different are these two beliefs that one will pop up in or show larger activity than the other? So I think that extremism is just it sits on the same place, in my opinion, at least, or I would assume, as many other faiths that we have that we just consider as okay, whereas the others, they see it as okay and we see it as absolutely not. But if there is any research, Danielle will be the perfect address to that, so I'll let her speak.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not aware of any particular study looking at the brain in this context. What has been done is, for example, to see what is happening. Well, basically, if one can influence people's opinions by showing them, for example, videos. So, and I think this is one interesting avenue, because obviously nobody is born with a certain idea, but you could definitely look more into what is happening in the brain whilst new ideas get planted and evolve. However, this kind of research has a big problem, and that's an ethical problem, because you would be actively radicalizing people. So what has been done so far has been at a rather low level. And it's interesting because, for example, in this particular experiment, they have shown jihadi material to Muslims and non-Muslims. And interestingly enough, the stronger effect was on non-Muslims. Yeah. So, so much about, I mean, what I'm arguing is that you can definitely change people's opinions through propaganda. And this, it doesn't have to be somebody from a particular place, from a particular culture. So I think, your point is very valid in that, there's stuff going on, certain mechanism that we should definitely have more insights into from this psychological perspective, perhaps as well.
Okay, so our final question is, what should we do to help support de-radicalization? Sagi?
I think there are several things that can be done. I think some of them were mentioned. One of the most important thing is, again, dialogue. One thing that we especially love to do in the organization where I'm part of is to create a certain dissonance in people that is very instantaneous and surprising, and this way break barriers. One thing that we did, for example, we created a training program, CrossFit and self-defense programs for youth, both from like both Syrian refugees, Muslims from Vienna, and members of the Jewish community. But we didn't tell anybody who is who. People came, there was no introduction. People just started to work out together. They were divided into pairs. They had to hold each other's legs as they did pull-ups or all kind of other activities. The trainer was one of our Muslim martial artists. So it was all quite serious. Everybody had fun, laughed together. And then at the end, everybody stood in half a circle and everybody had to introduce themselves. So everybody said where they're from. And so suddenly the person, like one person is from Syria, the person next to him is from the Jewish community. I said, of course, I'm from Israel, and so everybody was quite shaken. And then the question was, how does it make you feel that you worked out for an hour now with somebody, you know, from this background? What do you feel? And everybody was extremely amazed by how great it was. You know, these are just great people, laughed from the same jokes. You know, they both felt the same physical reaction to the activity. They're both human. And then everybody hugged each other, basically. And this is the kind of activities that we try to do. Another activity that we did was taking both Muslims, exactly same background people, and people from the Jewish community to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. Now, of course, this is a bit difficult. There were some preparation meetings before that, but basically also to sit people down and talk about the different groups. What does it mean to be a member of the group where you're from? What values did you gain from this group? What are maybe whether it's dangerous sometimes to, you know, to see other groups negatively only because there are other groups. And so the dialogue that it produced yielded amazing results. People were crying, or people really did not know even that places like that existed, and received it really positively. That's what I can say from my side. Yeah.
Inspiring. Wow. Daniela?
Definitely, I couldn't agree more. This is something that we need to do a lot more in Vienna. I mean, we're lucky that in Vienna it's really, really mixed. So in all the districts, there's all sorts of nationalities. But still, there has to be more done, you know, exactly what you just said before, to, you know, to prevent, because we're talking about regular people at this point, you know. Otherwise, just perhaps briefly, I think the two most important things that you need to do in order to de-radicalize a person is to make sure that he has or she has some kind of occupation that gives them self-esteem, that, you know, they can still do something with their lives, although, yeah, because leaving everything behind is not easy. They invested a lot, and they have to A, accept they were wrong, and B, lose everything, all the time they invested, all the friends. So you need to be able to give them something, you know, to make their life, you know, mean something still. And second, get them away from the group. They need to go in different social networks, in you know, see different people. This is the bare minimum, you know, and if you do this, then I think everything else has a chance. Yeah.
Wow. So thank you so much for such an important conversation about such a difficult topic. Thanks you very much to Daniela and to Sagi.
Thank you so much, and also for the questions and for being here with us and listening to us.
So let's take a look at
pleasure.
how to stay in touch with Daniela and Sagi. There we have Daniela's website. It is oiip.ac.at, or you can just look her up, Daniela Pisoiu. And Daniela, people can write to you an email here, info@oiip.ac.at.
No. Can just Daniela.Pisoiu, just the two names, and then at oiip.ac.at.
Okay.
Or you can just Google me. If you
there it
Google
is.
me,
Excuse me.
oh yeah, there it is.
There it is. Okay. Wonderful. Perfect. Okay. And Sagi, we can stay in touch with you on your website, sagizilbershatz.com. Sagi, I think you have to turn your microphone
Exactly.
on.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Absolutely. So
Wonderful.
you can text me if you want to connect, with great pleasure.
Wonderful. And there's your phone number. Wonderful. Okay, perfect. So coming up next week on Wednesday, we have Sean Hickey, Naxos, and music distribution. Have you ever wondered where the music you're listening to comes from? It usually involves musicians, but also a whole lot of non-musicians too. Composer and Naxos of America executive Sean Hickey is here to tell us a bit about that whole process as it is today and how it might look tomorrow. Come welcome Sean to our show. As always, all information about upcoming shows is available at www.simeonmoro.com. So that's next Wednesday, Sean Hickey, Naxos, and music distribution. So again, thank you to Daniela Pisoiu, to Sagi Zilbershatz, and to Professor Lino Rivera. Thank you also to Maurice Hissink, who has been helping us create a podcast from this show. And most of all, thanks to you, our participants, who make it all worthwhile. So from Vienna, Austria, and from the Bay Area, California, goodbye. See you next Wednesday.